Love is an incredibly complex feeling that can cloud the mind so intensely that it sometimes poses a serious threat to one's life. Usually, a person is able to regain control in time and avoid danger, but occasionally circumstances can be extremely unfavorable for the victim of passion. This is exactly the fate that befell the heroine of our story today. Julie Scully was the daughter of Julia and John Scully. Her childhood was filled with difficulties and hardships, so it's worth starting the story with her parents. Julie's mother was born in 1943 on an Indian reservation located in the state of New Mexico, which was the second largest in the USA. However, despite the vast territory, living conditions there were extremely challenging. The lack of electricity, running water, and jobs led to rampant alcoholism and drug addiction among the local population. When Julia turned 12, her parents, trying to protect their daughter from the detrimental influence of her environment, sent her to a boarding school, hoping that she would learn English there and acquire the necessary skills for a successful future. Upon reaching adulthood, Julia moved to the city and began living like an ordinary American. However, while working in a hospital for the mentally ill, she herself became addicted to drugs. Later, the young Native American woman met a police officer named John, and in 1964, feelings ignited between them. Just 2 days before their one-year anniversary, on July 2, 1965, the couple got married. Shortly after the wedding, John was transferred to serve in one of the most dangerous areas of North Philadelphia. On January 3, 1968, the couple had a daughter, whom they named Julia. Over the years, the girl became very close to her father. All the relatives noted that she was ready to do anything for his approval. John and Julie spent a lot of time together, often going fishing. During these moments, the girl's mother felt like an outsider in the family. While the father had fun with his daughter, the elder Julia suffered from loneliness. All this time, she hid her drug addiction from her loved ones, although those around her could not help but notice the woman's strange and unpredictable behavior. The situation only worsened as Julia moved on to even harder illegal substances. Despite this, on November 10, 1969, another baby was born into the family, a boy named John Patrick Scully. The infant immediately became the center of attention for the parents, and the elder daughter Julie began to feel a lack of love and care. At the same time, her mother continued to use illegal substances, being in a state of constant exhaustion. Any attempts to quit were accompanied by severe withdrawal. In 1973, amid all these problems, the elder Julia tried to take her own life by swallowing a whole pack of sleeping pills. But her husband found her in time, provided first aid, and called an ambulance. The doctors managed to save the woman. Now the whole family knew about her destructive addiction, but this did not improve the situation at all. The once beautiful Native American woman increasingly resembled a living corpse. Soon she tried to settle scores with life for the second time, this time due to depression. But again, she was saved. Of course, the parents' troubles could not but affect the children, especially the elder daughter, who had just turned 9 at the time. Friends came to her birthday party, but right in the middle of the celebration, her dad suddenly left. As it turned out, he went to his mistress, with whom he had been having an affair for quite some time. John considered this relationship his outlet, as his drug-addicted wife only caused him disgust. It was only the children that kept him together with Julia. On the day of his daughter's birthday, the mistress came to pick up John right at their house. The wife saw her rival with her own eyes when she went outside to see where her husband had gone. John didn't seem to be bothered at all by the fact that his secret was out. Instead, these events came as a real shock to the younger Julie and her mother. The girl began to blame herself for what happened, as she simply could not comprehend the reasons for her father's behavior. From that moment on, Julie's grades at school, where she had been an excellent student, dropped to C's. Then her father decided to transfer her to another school in Kensington. In the new educational institution, the bright and attractive Julie quickly became popular, but also fell into bad company. Truancy began, and her grades worsened again. At that time, the girl was only 12, but her appearance already attracted the attention of many boys. An additional risk factor was that the Scully family lived in a disadvantaged area. The parents grew increasingly worried that Julie might follow in her mother's footsteps and also become addicted to illegal substances. Once, Julie invited her girlfriends for a sleepover, But when her mother came to check on them in the evening, her daughter was not in the room. The girls had simply run off to have fun. The frightened woman immediately called the police, and law enforcement officers eventually managed to find the schoolgirls in downtown Philadelphia. After this incident, the relationship between Julie and her mother became even more strained. Constant conflicts and quarrels turned into a common occurrence. The girl's rebellious spirit grew stronger, even affecting her relationship with her father. But since John was a cop, he always knew where and with whom his daughter was spending time. Noticing that his wife was not coping with raising the teenagers, the man decided to take custody of the children himself. The elder Julia was sent for treatment for drug addiction. While the mother was away from home, the atmosphere in the family was much calmer. Despite the younger Julie's sincere desire to please her father, youthful maximalism took over. The girl continued to spend a lot of time with friends, skipped school, and received poor grades. Upon learning about this, John became furious. At that time, Julie was 14 years old, and she directly told her father that she wanted to quit her studies. Perhaps such a protest was caused by a lack of parental attention and support. It should be noted that by that time, Julie had already turned into a real beauty and invariably found herself at the center of attention at any party. So it's not surprising that the girl preferred entertainment to trying to earn her father's approval. At 14, Julie had already begun her sexual life. In 1982, she graduated from high school, and her parents, of course, hoped that their daughter would pursue higher education. John, using his official position, arranged with the administration of an engineering school for Julie to be admitted outside the competition. The man insisted that his daughter, a Native American, should be given certain preferences. Eventually, his efforts paid off, and in the fall of 1983, the girl became a student at the educational institution her father had dreamed of. Julie's younger brother chose a different path in life. Despite growing up under identical conditions, as soon as he turned 16, the boy enlisted in the Navy. As for Julia, she decided that she had had enough. Shortly after entering the engineering school, she dropped out and got a job, striving for financial independence. Around the same time, the girl started a romance with Neil Ziegler, who was 6 years older than her. Their relationship developed rapidly, and already in November 1985, just a few months before Julie's 18th birthday, the couple got married. The marriage was kept secret even from the bride's own father. The union with an adult man brought Julie not only material well-being, but also emotional stability. When John finally found out about the secret wedding, he approved of his daughter's choice, believing that marriage would be better for her than living with a drug-addicted mother. But this marriage turned out to be short-lived. In 1988, the couple divorced, and Julie was forced to return to her mother. At her new job, the girl did not even try to help her mom financially or pay for her own living expenses in her mother's house. Instead, Julie immersed herself in the world of beauty and entertainment. Her appearance was in full bloom at that time wherever this girl appeared. She invariably attracted admiring glances. Many considered Julie to be a professional model. Realizing the power of her charm, the young woman began to actively take advantage of her attractiveness. Despite her inner fragility and vulnerability, she desperately sought love, although she only found short-term affairs. Suitors swarmed around the beauty, inviting her on dates and to parties. In the summer of 1989, at a reception at a yacht club, Julie met Tim, a handsome man 11 years her senior. Tim owned a thriving landscaping business and could afford a luxurious lifestyle, including his own yacht. Back in the early 1980s, he founded his company, and since then, his career had been steadily on the rise, which was greatly facilitated by the boom in the US real estate market. The romance between Julie and Tim developed stormily, and it almost immediately became apparent that the girl had a very jealous nature. Once, Tim met his secretary, with whom he had worked for more than a year, at a bar. Seeing them together, Julie attacked Tim's friend with her fists and smashed her lover's face. The girl didn't even listen to explanations that it was a purely business meeting. Later, the conflict was settled, but it became a vivid illustration of Julie's difficult temper. The girl had long dreamed of a modeling career, and then, in one of the newspapers, she came across an ad for a beauty contest. Julie became fired up with the idea of participating in the competition, and Tim was sure that his beloved would definitely win. The lovers selected the most striking photos of the girl and sent them to the editorial office of the magazine organizing the contest. But after some time, it turned out that the contest was a fiction this way. The publishers simply lured gullible beauties in order to get spicy photos for the men's section on the last pages for free. Once, when visiting his office, Tim did not find his secretary at her desk. Instead, Julie was sitting there who, with a charming smile, informed him that the former assistant would not return. Just like that, without further ado, she simply took her lover's place, leaving him no choice but to accept her as an employee. This clever maneuver allowed Julie to work remotely from home, and at the same time provided financial independence and freedom of action. All this time, Julie did not stop monitoring the mail, hoping to receive a response from the magazine holding the beauty contest. But the expected letter never came, and this infuriated the girl. When she finally realized that she would not be awarded any prizes, she decided to act radically. Julie burst right into the editor-in-chief's office, shaking with rage. She demanded an explanation for why she had not yet received the award for her victory. In the end, the editor accepted her photos and promised to publish them in the next issue. The girl blabbed to everyone about her triumph and began actively preparing for the upcoming contest, which indeed took place sometime later in a posh hotel. 12 finalists attended this beauty competition, including Julie. But despite all her efforts, the judging panel gave preference to other participants. Only one jury member voted for our heroine. However, even this unfortunate incident had its positive side. Julie made friends with an editor named Cheryl. It was thanks to this acquaintance that the girl's photo made it onto the magazine's cover and on billboards hung all over the city. Such publicity brought Julie even more attention, and offers for modeling work poured in. By the fall of 1990, the girl had already become a local celebrity. This process was gaining tremendous momentum. Julie continued to work for Tim, but at the same time managed to win prizes at local beauty contests. True, she was met with failure on the serious runway. On November 16, 1991, the young couple got married. At that time, the bride had turned 23. The couple earned a good income and did not deny themselves anything. Julie's modeling career slowly moved upward until 1997, and her income grew accordingly. Later, the aspiring model appeared on television, but along with this, the girl began to abuse alcohol. The relationship with her husband resembled a roller coaster. UPS were replaced by downs, although in general, love and understanding reigned between the spouses. Tim dreamed of children, especially since their financial situation quite allowed them to have kids. But Julie stubbornly postponed this issue, fearing that pregnancy and childbirth would ruin her modeling career, which was beginning to gain momentum. Nevertheless, in February 1995, Julie became pregnant. Her girlfriends claimed that the expectant mother continued to smoke and drink throughout her pregnancy. On November 26, 1996, a girl was born, whom they named Katie Scarlett. Motherhood completely turned Julie's life around, and she enthusiastically immersed herself in raising her firstborn. During this period, her own mother, the elder Julia, finally overcame her bad habits and actively helped her daughter take care of the baby. True, due to differences in views on parenting, arguments often flared up between the women. Meanwhile, the younger Julie was hit by postpartum depression, partly due to the loss of her perfect figure after pregnancy. She kind of withdrew into herself, not even trying to regain her former shape. Against this background, her relationship with Tim also began to deteriorate. Already in April 1997, the couple was forced to turn to a family psychotherapist. It seemed to Julie that the psychologist took her husband's side, although in fact, the specialist was trying to understand the girl's deep-seated problems and complexes, touching on painful memories of the past. As a result, he concluded that Tim paid too little time and attention to his wife, which led to a crisis in their marriage. Julie felt unbearably lonely, sought solace in communicating with friends, often returning home tipsy. In November 1997, the couple planned a traditional cruise, which they usually took every year since they got married. But this time, they decided to postpone the trip in order to celebrate Christmas on board the liner. The main purpose of this cruise was to improve the relationship between Julie and Tim, while their daughter was left in the care of her grandparents. On November 1st, the couple flew to San Juan, the capital of Puerto Rico, where they boarded a cruise ship. Almost immediately, the spectacular and attractive Julie caught the attention of a young man named George Skiadopoulos, who held the lowest position in the ship's engineering department. But the next day, he introduced himself to the girl as the ship's captain. The guy even made a bet with a friend that he could get Julie into bed. George was only 22 at the time, had just graduated from college, and was just beginning his career. But despite this, the young man looked quite respectable and solid, so that Julie did not suspect any deception. The sly fellow lied to his new acquaintance that he was 28, and also bragged about a couple of his supposedly own achievements in order to impress her. Julie, who was 29 at the time, quickly became close to George. Tim saw them together a few times, but did not attach much importance to it. He was used to his wife's sociability and friendliness, as she often communicated with strangers, so he didn't even think to be jealous. On the eve of the party, the fake captain invited Julie on a tour of the engine room, which she readily agreed to. A spark ran between them, and the young people kissed, but nothing further happened for now. Upon returning home, an inspired Julie enthusiastically told her family's best friend Tony about her feelings. The girl was sure that the flash of passion would fade with initial speed, as she and George would never see each other again. But lo and behold, soon the supposed captain sent Julie a touching letter. The lovers switched to daily telephone communication. The secret admirer literally showered Julie with compliments, convincing her that Tim was not good enough for her. Tim knew about these conversations, as he accidentally overheard his wife cooing with someone on the phone a couple of times. But the man did not delve into the details of the conversations, fully trusting his better half. On the other hand, these secret relations completely baffled Julie. She seemed to be torn between the usual family comfort and a mad attraction to a young lover who gave her previously unknown acute sensations. The woman noticeably distanced herself from her husband and child, immersing herself in a whirlpool of new experiences. Tim saw that something wrong was happening and became worried. To strengthen the marriage, the man decided to arrange a lavish surprise party for Julie on the occasion of her 30th birthday. The celebration, which took place on January 3, 1998, was a great success. Julie's closest friends gathered at the birthday girl's house. As a gift, Julie persistently begged Tim for another cruise, and it had to be on a specific liner and at a strictly defined time. Of course, her main goal was to meet George. The husband resisted in every possible way, but eventually yielded to his wife's desire. And so on February 13th, the couple again went on a short trip. On board, Julie finally united with her chosen one, and George won the bet from his shipmates. Upon returning home, an inspired Julie could not stop telling stories about her spectacular love adventure, entrusting the most intimate details to the godfather of their daughter Katie, the same family friend Tony. But even for this devoted servant, it was unbearable to keep such a burden a secret, which the man later confessed to Julie. However, this did not stop her, and our heroine decided to secretly rush to Greece to see her beloved, whom she missed so much. For Tim and the family, she portrayed this trip as a family vacation, which she would allegedly go on with her mother and daughter. Julie confessed her real intentions to her mother, but, despite the condemnation, still insisted on her own. The first stage of this adventure assumed that the entire female Scully trio would go to Florida, but already on March 26, 1998, Julie left her mother and granddaughter and rushed to Puerto Rico, into the arms of her lover. There she immersed herself in a whirlpool of passion. Upon returning from her travels, Julie did not even think to hide her relationship with George from Tim. She hung on the phone around the clock, incessantly cooing with the Greek, sent him frank love messages by email, and shot videos about her life, which she also sent to her chosen one. And Julie did all this without hiding from her lawful husband, under the same roof with him and on his money. Moreover, having completely lost all fear, the woman again began to regularly frequent parties and get drunk senseless. Tim, of course, could not help but notice his wife's strange behavior. Hoping to save the family, in the 7th year of their married life, he suggested that Julie visit a psychologist. But instead of gratitude, during the very first session, she stated that she wanted a divorce. The stunned Tim flatly refused. The thing is, Julie owned a share in his business, which brought in about $1 million in profit annually. The woman desperately needed this money, as she planned to dash off to Greece with her daughter and settle there with her lover. Meanwhile, George had to undergo compulsory 20-month military service. Julie was bending over backward to help him escape to the States and get a visa, but she no longer had the money for it. Against the backdrop of all these emotional upheavals, Miss Scully began taking antidepressants. When George found out about this, he became terribly angry, strictly forbidding his beloved to take any medications. To please her chosen one, Julie undertook to get in shape. Suffering from insomnia, the girl constantly took sleeping pills and other serious drugs. At the same time, Julie exhausted herself with workouts, losing about 10 kilograms. She hoped to return to the modeling business and earn some money. But George turned out to be an even greater owner than Tim. He was terribly jealous and categorically did not approve of such intentions. As a result, the girl was forced to abandon this idea. None of Julie's relatives and friends supported her relationship with the Greek. Even Cheryl, who had once pumped up Scully in the modeling industry, openly condemned this romance. Meanwhile, the emotional state of our heroine was rapidly deteriorating. Once Tim asked his wife to give him access to business documents, but she locked the door to her room and didn't let anyone in. The police had to be called to take the papers necessary for work. And even this did not pacify the enraged Julie, who put up a frenzied resistance to law enforcement officers. At the same time, Julie developed paranoid delusions that her husband had allegedly hired a private detective to follow her. The atmosphere in the Scully house was heating up to the limit, and everything was heading towards an inevitable divorce. But while the family drama was approaching its climax, somewhere in the middle of summer, George and Julie met in the USA and secretly got engaged. The future Mrs. Skiadopoulos openly told everyone who would listen that she would soon move to Greece forever, but she hid the specific date from everyone according to the plan. This was to happen no earlier than next year. In the midst of these turbulent events, Tim received an itemized bill for his wife's international phone calls. The amount reached $6,000 to $7,000 a month. It was at that moment that the terrible truth finally dawned on the man. His wife was cheating on him with some ship engineer and had been maintaining contact with him behind her lawful husband's back for quite some time. The enraged Scully realized that he had had enough of feeding the ungrateful traitor, and he needed to get rid of all this lies as soon as possible and formalize the divorce. He frankly made all his claims to Julie. In response to the quite justified accusations, the offended wife stated that she was depriving Tim of the right to see his daughter. Julie dreamed of complete custody of Katie in order to go to another country with the little one without hindrance. Of course, these plans met with violent resistance from her husband. While the spouses were sorting out their relationship, a new interesting circumstance appeared. George informed his beloved that he was quitting his job and would personally come to visit her in New Jersey. Due to quarrels and conflicts with Tim, Julie reached the peak of an emotional crisis. The woman experienced inhuman stress, against the background of which she even began to lose her hair. But in Scully's clouded mind, all these troubles were explained solely by the forced separation from her beloved. At the same time, the girl rapidly developed paranoia. She was mortally jealous of George to all persons of the female sex without exception, and constantly demanded that her chosen one be in touch around the clock. But as soon as the Greek arrived in New Jersey, their crazy romance finally turned into complete madness. George, who had just lost his job, constantly asked Julie how much money she had, and openly incited his beloved to the most ridiculous expenses. In order to somehow pacify the insatiable suitor, the woman began to borrow money from her own husband. At the same time, Julie completely stopped communicating with her young daughter, and had not seen her for several weeks. All this drove Tim crazy. Resentment and anger almost tore him apart from the inside. And George, as if mocking, constantly lied to Julie about his supposedly outstanding achievements and huge profits. The absurdity of the situation was that this skinny, miserable-looking, slicked-back Greek with rotten teeth did not at all resemble a wealthy, handsome man from the modeling business or an influential businessman. However, Julie's behavior was an even bigger surprise. The woman desperately loved the unprepossessing jester, groveled before him, and was ready to give up everything she had, without regret, for the sake of this insidious manipulator. Friends and family tried in every possible way to dissuade Scully from this outright madness. They sincerely could not understand how one could lose their head over an objectively unattractive, unemployed loser without certain life prospects, who was also known for his mendacity, jealousy, and propensity for violence. However, Julie seemed to have been seized by a love fever. She nurtured crazy plans about how she would spend all the money received after the divorce on an expensive hair transplant for her bald admirer, and then take care of his teeth. Tim, having learned about these wild plans of his wife, went berserk with rage. He was especially outraged by the fact that Julie was ready to involve their innocent daughter in this adventure. Scully threatened the traitor that in case Katie disappeared, he would personally see to it that the beloved daughter would never see her mother again. It seems that this promise somewhat cooled the ardor of the stubborn mistress. At least Julie herself began to tell her friends that her affair with the Greek was over. But it took only a few weeks before Scully once again dashed off with George to Greece, supposedly to test the strength of their feelings. During this trip, the woman met the pseudo-captain's parents and was completely delighted with them. It's just that, given the religiosity of her chosen one's family, Julie was forced to hide from her future relatives the existence of her daughter, her former marriage, and her modeling career. And upon returning home and from absolutely everyone else, Scully only dreamed of a life together with her beloved in fabulous Hellas. On December 6th, the day when Julie was to leave the house she still shared with Tim forever, the woman left her daughter in the care of her husband and moved to a hotel. There, Scully swallowed handfuls of psychotropic drugs and prepared to fly to Greece. Already on December 8, 1998, the lady who was head over heels in love landed in Athens. It was in this country that George and Julie planned to have a wedding and begin a new carefree life. Almost immediately after his beloved's arrival, the Greek persuaded her to open a joint bank account. Allegedly, his chosen one did not know the local language, and in general was not very good with finances. Blinded by passion, Miss Scully unreservedly trusted her liberator. Without a shadow of a doubt, she put all her savings, $80,000 in cash, into their joint account. And Julie gave her beloved another $18,000 for minor household expenses. This money was the last funds that the woman had at her disposal at that time. And soon she simply disappeared without a trace. On January 8th, Skiadopoulos called his fiancé's best American friend with terrible news Julie had gone missing. According to the Greek, they had agreed to have a snack at a local McDonald's, but the girl never showed up for the meeting. George allegedly waited for her for several hours, but it was all in vain. And since mobile communications did not exist at that time, he had no way to inform his beloved of his concern. Eventually, after a long and unsuccessful search, the grief-stricken groom turned to the police with a statement about the disappearance of Julie Scully. Shortly before George's alarming message about Julie's disappearance, her closest friend in the States received a call from Scully herself. In the conversation, the woman admitted that she terribly missed her daughter Katie and had some problems in her relationship with her fiancé. From what was said, the friend concluded that Julie was about to leave the Greek and should return home in the near future. However, time passed, but Mrs. Scully never appeared on the doorstep of her family home. Against this background, the news from George about her friend's mysterious disappearance caused sincere horror and concern. The pseudo-captain relayed that on the day of the disappearance, Julie left her passport in the car, which was later somehow confiscated by the police. The biggest problem was that Skiadopoulos allegedly could not find the law enforcement officer who took the document in any way. This whole story sounded extremely suspicious, so the friend eventually decided to call Tim Scully, who was the only one who could help sort out the situation. The man immediately realized that his ex was in big trouble. Tim recalled that the last time Julie personally reached out to relatives in the USA was on January 7th, and since then, there had been no news of her. Around the same time, the mother of the missing woman told her son-in-law that Skiadopoulos gave the impression of a worthless and disgusting type. Besides being an unpleasant subject by nature, the Greek obviously did not keep himself in check at all. The elder Julia once witnessed with her own eyes how George attacked her daughter during a quarrel, and when the woman stood up for her child, the enraged Greek attacked her. He yelled, swore like a trooper, and then grabbed the old woman by the throat and pressed his mother-in-law against the wall with all his might. The inhuman man did not let go of the victim until she threatened to call the police. After that incident, Julie allegedly tried to break up with the sadist. She even called law enforcement, after which Skiadopoulos was deported from the country. But despite everything, after some time, the girl once again rushed after her beloved to Greece. Moreover, Julie justified this scum in every possible way, taking the blame for the incident upon herself. So Scully's mother had no doubt that this scoundrel George was definitely involved in her daughter's disappearance. However, Skiadopoulos himself tirelessly portrayed himself as an innocent lamb and provided the Greek police with all possible assistance in the search for his bride. Julius' relatives tried to contact the U.S. Embassy in Athens in parallel. Unfortunately, cooperation with the Hellenistic cops was significantly hampered by the language barrier. Not a single law enforcement officer involved in the search for the missing American woman spoke English. Then the FBI finally intervened in the case. Almost immediately, the feds found out that Julie's passport had actually been with George all these days. The Greek initially assured that he found the document much later, and when he learned about the FBI's interest in the case, he stated that the papers were simply stolen. The behavior of the main suspect seemed increasingly strange with each passing day. For example, Skiadopoulos even tried to withdraw money from his joint account with Julie, but for some reason, he failed. On January 23, 1999, the ill-fated couple was supposed to have a wedding. Instead, all the country's news TV channels and radio stations were flooded with one topic: a young woman from the USA who had gone missing. And George went berserk and threw a tantrum when he found out that his bride's closest American friend had also intervened in the publicity of this story. He screamed into the telephone receiver about his non-involvement and even made several statements to the press. The frightened Greek gave numerous interviews to various media in which he desperately tried to justify himself and prove his complete innocence. But all these efforts were in vain. Just 16 days after the disappearance of Julie Scully, George found himself in the investigator's office as the main suspect. At first, he stubbornly retold law enforcement the same fairy tales that he had been weaving for the media. However, it took less than 4 hours of painstaking work before the suspect cracked and confessed to the murder of his beloved. Skiadopoulos insisted that it was a terrible accident. It seemed that the man really regretted what he had done, because he wept throughout the interrogation. But very quickly, this story was overgrown with a whole bunch of new, absurd, and frankly false details. Getting confused in his testimony, George either convinced the cops that Julie had never disappeared at all, then again admitted his guilt, then once again renounced any crime. Eventually, the Greek gave the following story. Allegedly, shortly after moving to Greece, Julie became very disappointed in both the country itself and her chosen one. Every day she unbearably missed her home, little daughter, usual life, and longed to return to America immediately. George claimed that he tried in every possible way to console and calm his beloved, but he failed. Every day, Julie's depression only deepened. On one of the last days before the disappearance, Scully simply could not stop the flow of tears and rushed to flee from Hellas with all her might. Additionally, the situation was aggravated by the fact that around the same time, the future mother-in-law found out about the existence of her son's fiancé's ex-wife and child. From that moment on, George's mother completely stopped hiding her disdain for her son's chosen one and openly advised him to get rid of this adventuress as soon as possible. On this basis, they had such violent conflicts with their son that the couple was even evicted from the hotel room once. At the same time, George found nothing better than to vent all his anger on Julie. He was jealous of her, forbade her to call relatives, and most importantly, regularly severely beat her. Later, it became known that Skiadopoulos himself most likely inherited mental disorders from his schizophrenic mother. At the very least, the Greek was distinguished by a clearly inflated self-esteem, which with his repulsive appearance, manifested itself in ugly arrogance and selfishness. George demonstrated the talent of a manipulator, as the relatives and friends of the deceased later told, and at the slightest disagreement, he attacked Julie with his fists. By the way, the elder Julia was not the first and not the only victim of the Greek's beating. There is documentary evidence of at least one more of his attacks, once the psychopath almost tore off Scully's arm. However, even then the woman covered for her tormentor, justifying herself to everyone that she was injured by accident. And despite all this horror, she continued to live with the tormentor under the same roof. It was against this eerie background that the events of January 8, 1999 took place. It was then that the couple went on a long car trip to Athens. The road along which the lover's car was winding was practically deserted, a typical section of the Greek outback with 2 lanes and not a soul around. Later, another fierce quarrel broke out between Julie and George. The enraged Skiadopoulos abruptly swerved onto the side of the road and braked in a hiding place where the passengers in the cabin could not be noticed by other road users. Emptiness, silence, and darkness reigned around. The Greek, devoid of human features, jumped out of the car, and a moment later, with an inhuman roar, attacked Julie. Clasping his beloved's neck with his hands, the inhuman man squeezed her throat with inhuman force, seeking only one thing: to stifle the cries and pleas of his victim as soon as possible. Later, during interrogation, the killer confessed to the cops that at that fatal moment, He seemed to be watching his own atrocities from the side, unable to control either the situation or himself. According to Skiadopoulos, the sadist simply could not come to his senses in time and let go of Julie while she was still showing at least some signs of life. George assured the investigation that this whole nightmare lasted only a few seconds. However, forensic experts knew well that strangulation requires at least 23 minutes of continuous neck compression. After all he had done, the killer, according to his own testimony, almost lost his mind. At first, he allegedly wanted to burn the mutilated body of his beloved and scatter her ashes over the sea from a cliff, and then jump down himself to reunite with Julie after death. But in the end, he never dared to take this step. However, given the place where George's story took place, the interrogation room, the investigators did not really believe his sweet tales about a suicide attempt. Judging by everything, after the murder, Skiadopoulos did not even think about following his beloved to the other world. At that interrogation, the Greek muttered something about unsuccessful attempts to shoot himself with an air gun, throw himself under the wheels of a truck, and swallow a deadly dose of medicines. But all these masterfully invented plans were never implemented probably. The psychopath was simply afraid, which is why he changed his mind. The reality was much more horrible and eerie. According to the killer's own confession, the first thing he did was shove the bloodless body of his beloved into the trunk of the car, drive to the nearest gas station, fill up a full tank, and return to the scene of the crime. After that, Skiadopoulos dragged the bloody Julie into a field. Away from the road, it was there that two small lakes were visible. Without thinking twice, the beast doused the tortured girl with fuel and set her on fire. However, a sudden rain extinguished the fire, so the body was only partially burned. Although George even considered the option of simply drowning the disfigured remains in the nearest lake. In the end, he decided it was better to put the charred corpse back in the trunk. This time, the sadist drove in the opposite direction, to his grandmother's house. There in the pantry, the maniac found a huge suitcase in which he planned to place Julie's remains. But the so-called rigor mortis stood in the way, as a result of which the tortured body stiffened and did not want to bend. And it was also impossible to shove the dead woman's head into the suitcase, so George took it in cold blood and personally cut Scully's head. Grabbing the severed part by the hair, the killer raised it to the level of his eyes. Later, during interrogation, the Greek confessed to the investigators that at that moment, genuine horror was visible in Julie's dead pupils. However, even after death, the girl seemed incredibly beautiful to him. So as a farewell, the psychopath passionately kissed the bloody lips of his lifeless bride. After these disgusting manipulations, Skiadopoulos packed the mutilated torso into a suitcase, burned it, and threw the charred remains into the middle of the nearest swamp. But George decided to keep Julie's severed head as a creepy trophy. Later, he still got rid of it by throwing it from a high bank into the sea. The girl's body was found only 19 days after her disappearance, and not anywhere else, but at the very place of the murder, where law enforcement officers were brought personally by George, who was already imprisoned at that time. The widow of the deceased, Tim Scully, flew to Greece to identify his wife with his own eyes and settle all the formalities for transporting her mutilated remains to her homeland. But even with this, the terrible story of Julie did not end. A scandal broke out around the case after scandal. For example, George suddenly decided to publicly call himself a murderer, repeating his confession live on Greek television. Upon hearing this, the suspect's mother had a stroke, and his grandmother had an acute nervous breakdown. Meanwhile, Tim's father asked the police in surprise why Skiadopoulos was allowed to live after such a brutal murder. In his opinion, the sadist should have committed suicide immediately after the deed. Instead, frankly cynical publications began to appear in some media outlets, which placed all the blame for the tragedy on the victim herself. However, the official authorities of Greece recognized this crime as almost the most terrible in the country's history. And from the very first days of the process, George's defenders took as a basis the version of the client's insanity, referring to hereditary schizophrenia, which allegedly passed to him from his mother. But despite this, the killer himself begged the court in despair for the highest measure of punishment. True, in Greece, the death penalty is not provided for even the most serious crimes, so theoretically, Skiadopoulos faced a maximum of life imprisonment. While the executioner was fighting for his life, Tim Scully turned out to be the only reliable support for everyone who knew and loved his late wife. Despite the betrayal he experienced, In the most difficult days, the man proved to be an amazingly kind and noble person. It was to Tim that Julie's best friends handed over a diary of memories about her, which their daughter Katie was supposed to read in a few years. And the relatives of the deceased sincerely hoped that the Greek had initially set his sights on Mrs. Scully solely for the money. They say the groom somehow found out about Tim's financial situation, which is why he decided to marry his wife. Perhaps the subsequent judicial division of property was just the main goal of the psychopath. But as soon as George realized that Julie was not going to invest the money obtained from her husband in the Greek's dubious business projects, he immediately brutally dealt with the recalcitrant passion. Be that as it may, the trial of Julie Scully's killer began on November 27, 1999, less than a year after the tragedy. Unlike the USA, Greek legal proceedings do not provide for the participation of a jury in the process. Usually such a case is considered by a panel of 3 professional servants of Themis, which significantly speeds up the course of justice. True, in the case of Skiadopoulos, there was not a single representative of the defense on the witness stand. As a result, the accused gave very lengthy testimony, which lasted about 5 hours, and already on December 6th, the court found 24-year-old George Skiadopoulos guilty on all counts of the indictment. The sadistic killer was sentenced to life imprisonment without the right to early release. But the surprises of Greek justice did not end there. In 2002, the life prisoner filed an appeal against the sentence, stating that at the time of Julia's murder, he was in a state of insanity. This time, the lawyers managed to convince the judges of the validity of their position. Skiadopoulos' life term was replaced by 23 years with the right to apply for parole. Thanks to this decision, already in 2007, the psychopath was released early and returned to his hometown of Kavala. The killer still lives there, surrounded by his new family. It's even scary to imagine whether George's current neighbors and acquaintances have any idea what this imposing man who once cold-bloodedly cut off his own bride's head is capable of. We sincerely hope that the fate of Julie Scully has not left you indifferent. If you found this eerie story interesting, share your impressions in the comments and don't forget to like it. And in order not to miss other no less fascinating stories, be sure to subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your attention and see you next time.